Same thing as yesterday, except we're going to roll the dice again. Actually, I don't know why I'm using that dice, but we're going to roll it again. If it's a number above 5 or 6, we'll do a multiple of the two combined. It is 1. Okay. Can we add another secret to what we did yesterday? Yeah. Okay. We're going to see if the way the lighting inside the objects changes throughout the day. We're going to measure it right after this, so at that time, and then a couple hours later, and then later at it's very early in the morning right now, so that works well. So we'll measure it now, noon-ish, and at sunset. But we'll have to roll the dice again to do something else in the process, but we'll work on this first one. Do you know what that is? It's the sun. Cool. And it is currently 8:13. Doesn't look. Yeah. And that's the biggest light in the environment. So I'm just going to take a picture to make it easier for me to tell the difference later on. Okay. So I wrote that down, the time that I captured the video of the sun, and we're going to go on the computer with the photo I took, and we're going to try to create an image out of the white part of the light in this, which is what we're using. Of course, it's not actually on the sun, it's actually on the jewel. It's a marble. Not really that wealth related, but it's also cool to do that. But that image we will then convert into a meaning of some kind, which we'll use later as a sort of philosophical portion to the project, which will be interesting. Well, I found plenty of shapes, but nothing recognized other than a bunny rabbit, maybe a cactus. No idea what that is. Yeah. Color them and ascribe some sort of relevance to reality to them. So I'll be right back. Okay. I didn't color this one because we'll use it for something else in relevance. But each of these is supposed to be an animal of some kind, including a human. That's a human. That is like a cat or something. That's a fish. That's a cactus. That's a bird. That's a mouse or an elephant. That's a hare. That's a snake. That's a rabbit. That will become relevant in a second. I just have to take a picture of this so I don't have to go back and forth from the computer. Alright. What is the relevance of animals and marbles and light? Science would say nothing at all. But we'll come up with some relationship. And it probably has to do with the forms of the animals and the interaction light has with matter or material before it evolves into animals, if that makes sense. So, we'll be back. Don't have to believe that to be the case. It's more like a hologram, or like a way of creating some concept. Not all concepts have to be believed, and this is mostly to show you how to manipulate perception and what appears useless but becomes useful when you start using it in interaction with the various things I've already talked about on these video recordings or vlogs, whatever they're called. I don't know. Animals and people alike are essentially geometry made from light, and a portion of that light reflects from the sun onto things around the earth. So in that contact, it creates different subtle forces, with lack of a better term, that cause the shape to change. In fact, everything you see is a shape made of light, because, you know, you see light. So not only is color a characteristic of light, but so is its shape. But it's not a single photon that creates that shape. It's actually a number of photons that create the shape. So its interaction is important. Okay, so the sun shines light on objects like rocks, and depending on their shape, they create different appearances. Through the grouping of photons. The shape doesn't exist because it's just a group of photons that touch a non-existent, or not non-existent, but touching atoms and then bouncing off of them into your eye. So the shape, while being very evident to humans, is not really an actual property of reality. But the the shape itself, while non-existent, so like say, I don't know, I guess it's a stocking. I guess it's Christmas time, so why not? Is an outline in space that represents the grouping of atoms, and the shape can be manipulated, you know that, without actually changing the shape through pareidolia. That could be a heart, if we look at it on the side. But the use we'll probably have to find using a dice and another source of information. So we'll get to that right now. 3. So 3 is depth. That honestly doesn't help, but let's try. Anyways. So while shape, like Marilyn Monroe with apple stickers over there, are not real, they don't exist in they don't exist in the atom. They're sort of like deeper in perception than the atom. The atom is like the paint inside that fills this, and the external part, or like the actual shape and the outline and the length and head and anything else in the room are all part of the background of reality rather than an explicit part of its physicality. Like, it's a deeper portion than just the atom. I'm not sure if that makes sense. It goes past the atomic scale simply because it's not in physicality or the substance, which you can't actually see because it's atoms. That's all it really is. This sword's appearance is deeper than the atomic portion, which, while being in front, is not what is behind it, in a similar sense to how there are layers on a painting, where the smaller details are put in front and the larger details behind it. That's why when you go closer to something and change the focus, you see more detail. I mean, that's too close for my camera, but you see that it's made of wood rather than just a flat sort of perception, if I unfocus it. Okay. That's why detail becomes more evident as you approach it, because the detail represents the higher layer or closer layer compared to the more distant layer that is here. Or at least that's my current conception of what this idea is. Like this, where the further the object is, the more distant the layer is, or the more depth there is to the layer. So as this moves further away, it gets smaller rather than bigger, and thus you're actually seeing a smaller and smaller form. If I went super far away from this, it would be the size of that dot. But the closer I get to the dot, the bigger it gets, and the less it's visible because the new layer has taken on the old one. And it does this without like covering anything in itself, but it does cover what's behind it, sort of like a flat surface that has many rotating layers but never its own. Although when you rotate an object, it does kind of cover the rest. Like this is covering itself as I rotate it. So while not completely clear, the sword changes based off its distance and layered perception, which is brought on by the light, because this brings closer access to the light that reaches a smaller detail compared to the light over here, which has less detail because it traveled further from the sword to your eye. Further information can be grasped from the idea that a photon, when it hit a blue or black substance, takes on a lower frequency and a lower piece of information. In a metaphorical way, it takes the information of that point or that atom and then bounces back off it in some other direction. I don't know how often light curves, but usually travels in a straight line. Actually, no, it's a wave, so it actually does do that, kind of. But the information that it keeps is always relevant to where it originated, unless it is bent by some sort of light altering perception, which means that Marilyn Monroe might not actually be where she is. She might just appear as such because the air actually distorts the light in a slight way, and your cornea also does too. So she might not actually be there, she just appears as such, and your hands and body and stuff happen to be able to reach it through its own perception, or not perception, but position, which isn't necessarily any more accurate than Marilyn, but because they still match up to reality, you can touch stuff like hold this pen, even if your eye distorts the actual reality of your hand or changes its exact position. Much like a mirror still reflects reality, but doesn't do it the same way. Like, I'd still be holding this pen in a mirror. It would just be on the opposite side because it's distorted in a different way. What I was getting at, though, is that the light holds a position, or like almost like a pixel, where it remembers where it came from, so that when you look where it is, it's always like the beam of light. Even if it changes, it still had to come from this point to reach this point. If it had come from a slightly different direction, it would have reached a different position. So it recognizes where it originated. depending on where and what, it actually knows whether it is a black color or a white color, which means that it knows both information and position of an atom. Relatively. I mean, I don't know if it knows the exact position of the electron, but it knows the exact position of the whole atom because it hits the electron, goes inside, and comes back out, if I understand physics. So that a scientist doesn't yell at me for spreading misinformation, I can't say whether this is true or false. It's mostly just theoretics and thought. It doesn't actually, unless I can show like something more observable than that, there's no reason to like take it as fact. Yeah. For the most part, what this is me guessing at different parts of reality and referring to memories of Wikipedia pages on light that I read at some point or learned at some point when, or just things that seem evident but aren't necessarily the case, because I also thought that maybe light isn't even a particle so much as it's a shape, because you can make shapes with sound, so oscillation and stuff can create geometry. But that's completely irrelevant to this subject matter. But it's about the difference between what you can and can't see, where I can see the light, but I can't see how it behaves at a smaller scale, and I don't have any instruments to test this kind of stuff either. But it is an interesting theory that could, with the right equipment, be tested and shown to be one or the other. And I can't do that right now. I'm mostly just messing with theories and stuff. I'm only saying this because, yeah, I don't want someone running around convinced it's true when I don't even know. What I was getting at with the information that I was explaining is that from a light source, the light travels, hits an atom, and depending on what the atom is, it receives some sort of information, which at the very minimum is color and position, which initially is from the light. So it hits that, it transfers it's absorbed by the atom, the light, at which point it emits another light photon, which travels in the same sense, but that absorbed light photon is changed in and changes the atom in some form, is what I'm getting at, is that the this was white, if they were both white and this was a black light for some reason, or blue light, we'll say it's a blue light because that's also true, the atom would receive a small bit of information of both the position from which it entered and the color of that thing. Then it would emit another photon, because that's what they do, and it would be of a different kind, so it would contain information from that atom, and it would transfer to another atom, where it would transfer information from the previous atom to the next atom, which is why this one's white and black. This one blue. This one is both blue because it got the blue information from, or I don't know quite how the pattern would work because it's confusing me, but this atom would exchange information through the light with this atom and this atom. What that would do is cause behaviors to change in the atom based off of its information that it received from the light, and thus it increases the chance ever so subtly of the atom moving in this direction rather than this direction. In certain cases, and with that difference, it then slowly organizes into some shape, irrelevant of whether it's an animal or an object, simply because it's more likely to land based off of the reference of the other atoms. But I have honestly no idea. It's just my theory, I guess, for this case. Anyways. Another fun piece of knowledge is that tests, even when they prove something wrong, usually demonstrate something about reality. So just because a theory is wrong doesn't mean you won't discover something when you try to show it legitimately, whether it's the case or not. It may provide an alternative effect, and thus, while not providing what you thought it was, may provide some alternative to the circumstance, if that makes sense. The problem is finding a way to show that when light hits this all the time, and there's no real way of knowing whether any of these will ever take on the shape of, at the very least, the light, because for it to do that, it has to go through some coincidental change to reach that point, and it hits so many other photons in the process that the information inside is no longer the same, and it ends up being more like a smoke of uncertainty rather than certainty. So it's not a predictive thing by its own definitions. However, there might be something else we can do if I roll that dice again. So let's do that. I'm rolling the dice, and this is actually pretty relevant to the concept we're working with, like the dice rolling, because it hit light and it's using properties inside itself to essentially decide where it's going to land. It landed on 2. So that means we're doing the potency aspect. That kind of makes sense, relevant to what we were doing before, but so we're going to go into the mind as a subject, and we're going to refer to the potency of it. And yeah, I'll be back. Remember the card trick that I did with the images? There's a cat coming out from behind the curtain, and I didn't even know it was there. Sorry, that was mildly distracting. she's also going to get in the way because she's going to go after the dice as soon as I throw it. Right, kitty? She's lying. See, watch. Yep. Okay, well, we have a cat with us. But the card trick works because the mind can perceive connections that were not numeric, and thus the visual perception of the images on the cards could be manipulated to show things like the Hunger Games. But numbers are not like that. So when I roll a dice and... Okay, that didn't work, but I had to say what it was. If I say the dice is going to be the number 4, there's a chance it could be, but it was not. And there's no way to change that because numbers are not pareidolia, and they are not symbolic. They're a different thing, which is why the number 1 doesn't work. I could say, oh, well, the shape of it, it's a 4, but like it's the exact same for all of them. And if I go with like 3, now I'm like looking really close at the thing for a symbol that looks like 3. And I'm not going to even find one, except maybe that F or that, maybe. But like, it's the same for all of them. It's on all sides. So it actually shows in certain respects that the number isn't going to help with uncertainty, and the pareidolia isn't going to help with predictability. So, while this dice may be related to the light when I shake it, there's not really any way for me to know whether or which light photon from which position caused this dice to land on 3. But we do have a potential for some kind of other means beyond our conventional understanding of number and our pareidolia perception of shape and lettering and symbols, which we don't have in number, but we do have in other aspects of reality. Which would mean something beyond number and beyond imagery. But that's what we're going to have to try to find, to try to have any more knowledge on how light affects a dice in our theory. Anyways,